morning. You caught me ruining a fill. I got there eventually. Don't you hate it when that happens? What was I doing? There we go. Anyway, welcome everybody. Welcome to Groove Improvisation number 3. Good morning. Hello on the chat there. Thank you for joining me. It is Friday morning, 11:30 a.m. What better time to talk about groove improvisation and this wonderful art form in which we are all involved. I'm going to be talking about the act of improvising within a groove, my concepts about that, how I approach that conceptually, technically, vocabulary based, and all of that stuff. And it's going to be continuing on from episodes 1 and 2. So if you haven't caught Groove Improvisation Workshops 1 and 2, I would suggest giving those a quick watch after this video if you want to catch up on those particular topics. In those episodes, I talked about 3 main things. I talked about finding the main skeleton figure that you're playing, the main groove, playing with and subverting expectations with the use of things like displacement and syncopation, and the decoration of that by using your vocabulary. And I covered that at great length, so give those a watch if you want to catch up on those. Today, I'm going to be talking more about the approach I was just kind of playing around with there when the stream kicked in, which is much more of a rhythmic based approach. I kind of think of that in the same way as I do with the sort of broken time jazz drumming that I talked about recently on one of these live streams. So that's going to be the sort of the main topic that we're on with today. As always, please let me know if I'm having any audio issues. I can adjust anything right here, so let me know if you can't hear me or anything like that. And as always, I'm trying to say this more and more. Thank you, Patreon subscribers. I really appreciate your support on this channel. So let's get down to business then. The concepts that I'm going to be talking about today were summed up to me really, really succinctly a number of years ago when I was lucky enough to have a lesson with Rodney Holmes. For those of you that know who Rodney Holmes is, you will know what a fantastic drummer he is. Very understated, extremely humble, extremely talented. He's a fierce player. And for those of you that have never heard of Rodney Holmes, I encourage you all to go and check him out because he's a wonderful player and a wonderful person as well. And I had seen him playing this sort of, that sort of thing, this fast fusion groove that he does so well. And I didn't really understand how he was doing it, and I booked a lesson with him, and I was asking him all about these things. And he was playing fills around the drums, really, really fast, really high octane, really high energy. And I said, how are you thinking about that? How are you distinguishing groove from fill? How are you playing your fills and incorporating them into the groove? What's that groove you're doing? What's the pattern? And all of these questions that a young drummer has. And he sort of, in his own way, he said, wait, slow down. Why do we need to distinguish between groove and fill? Can it not all be just time? Right? And for sort of 25-year-old me, a light switch came on. And I thought, time? What does he mean? And then he said he's essentially considering that groove in the same way that he considers jazz comping. So for those of you that are familiar with jazz or who have seen my broken time jazz drumming video recently, we know that time is implied through the use of all instruments on the kit. That sort of thing. It's not a pattern where we've learnt a pattern and we're repeating it every time. Instead, the time feel is implied through the use of the different voices working together. And as I say, that really opened a door for me. I was ready for that concept, I think. I'd never encountered it before, and he put it so succinctly for me that it stayed with me ever since. So, at the start of this video, I was doing a groove. That was kind of that sort of thing, right? So I want to talk about what I'm doing there and how that relates to the concepts I've just talked about. And it comes down to the use of rhythmic figures as part of our improvisation, as opposed to patterns. Now, patterns in drumming are vitally important. We can't escape patterns, and we shouldn't. They are a tool, they are a valuable learning tool, and they are a valuable performance tool, but they have their limitations. So, if we take a simple groove that we all know, probably the most important drum groove in the world, right? Called the money beat for a reason. It's a pattern. And when you learn this as a beginner, and when you teach this to other drummers, you teach them as a pattern. The right hand is doing a certain order of things. The bass drum comes in on a certain beat number. The bass drum and the snare drum alternate. The way we learn it mentally, the way our brain and nervous system learn it physically, is by putting all of these elements together as a pattern, okay? And when we start to learn varieties of this, variations of this pattern, that becomes a pattern in its own right. Now, even though that was improvised in that I hadn't planned to do that, that's still a pattern, a piece of vocabulary that I have internalized, practiced, worked on, and know how to use. Think of it as a word in the English language that I understand the meaning of so I can use it in sentences as the context dictates, right? But nevertheless, if my improvisation is built around patterns, I'm limited by that pattern's extent, right? I can't go beyond what's possible with that pattern. So if I go into something like this, I've changed patterns, right? I'm utilizing paradiddles there. That's a paradiddle-based groove, and it creates a nice effect and it sounds good, but it's nevertheless a pattern. I am regurgitating a pattern that I have learnt and memorized. And yes, I can decorate it a little bit and I can vary it, but I'm still playing a pattern at the end of the day. Now, what we are trying to do is kind of flick a little switch so that we're thinking less about patterns and more about the rhythmic figures instead. Now here, if we break that down to the rhythmic figure, at the heart of that, it's that, quarter notes, okay? We are taking that very simple, very basic, fundamental rhythmic figure, 1, 2, 3, 4, and we are voicing that as a backbeat, and we are adding that hi-hat just to provide a little bit of decoration and timekeeping, right? So even though this sounds absolutely great and is at the heart of some of the most popular songs ever written, anyone can dance to this, the rhythmic figure at the heart of it all is very simple. Now, a lot of patterns that we know, take this one. Has a more advanced rhythmic figure at the heart of it. Okay, you can start to hear, if we break it down to the underlying rhythmic figure, what that pattern is based on. When I was playing at the start of this video, and the sort of thing that Rodney Holmes was talking about to me all those years ago, was the improvisational aspect comes from the rhythmic figures, not the pattern we're playing. So rather than being set, here's our pattern, and here's the rhythmic figure it plays, we are changing the rhythmic figure on the fly. Some of you may have worked on Ted Reed's syncopation, right? Something like that, right? Ted Reed's syncopation, for those of you that don't know, is a collection of rhythmic studies, okay? No drum notation, just one-line rhythms, and the idea is you interpret those rhythms in a certain way. It's kind of like a reading study. The good thing about those is it gets you thinking in terms of rhythmic figures. So, when I'm playing a groove here, excuse me at the end there, I'm thinking in terms of a rhythmic figure without an end. I'm not just thinking here is a one-bar rhythmic figure, because then we get back into pattern territory. Instead, I'm thinking of that as just a constant rhythm and I'm trying to voice that between the bass drum, the snare drum, and the hi-hat. And as I've said on these previous groove improvisation live streams, you then use your vocabulary to decorate that process. So if I simplify, I can start to show you what I mean. And the best way to do this is to keep the hi-hat constant. And if you are new to this sort of playing, this is a good way to start practicing it as well. We keep that hi-hat constant and we decide that this is playing eighth notes. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Okay? Now against that eighth note rhythm, we want to start voicing rhythmic figures between the bass drum and the snare drum. I did this last time, but we can take the clave rhythm, right? How many different ways can we voice that same rhythm? Loads, right? There are lots more permutations or possibilities than that, but nevertheless, that figure. How do I work on my coordination and articulation as a beginner? Let me come to that in the end, because that's a good question. Stay with me. I will address that. But my groove now is the act of working that rhythmic figure into this rhythmic concept. And you can sing it to yourself. Da, 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 da. Okay. Then we can start to vary that rhythmic figure. We understand concepts like displacement or syncopation, where the notes in a rhythmic figure are moved or varied slightly. So rather than playing the same clave every time, I'm starting to play around with the notes in that clave as if it's a slalom gate, right? I know where those gates are, each note of that clave, but I can come really wide or I can go really accurately through it. As long as I'm keeping that clave in my mind, da, 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 I can apply my own rhythmic knowledge and my own vocabulary to voice that clave in an interesting way. So even though that sounds like it's a different rhythm, to my mind, as the one playing it, that is still based off the clave. Okay, it comes from me understanding that clave rhythmic figure and just moving the odd note here and there and voicing it between the bass drum and the snare drum. Now you will hear at this stage, my hi-hat is constant. And that's a really useful way to practice this, because we're keeping everything in context. It goes without saying how valuable it is to practice this with a metronome and counting and all of that good stuff that you all already know. But once we start to get comfortable with voicing a simple rhythm like a clave in this way, we can stop relying on that constant eighth note pattern, right? And one way that you can do this is to treat the hi-hat as kind of filling in the gaps between the main rhythmic hits. So if our clave rhythm, let's just take a simple voicing, just like that, right? You can hear the clave there voiced between the bass drum and the snare drum, and I've orchestrated it in a certain way just for practice purposes. I can then use my hi-hat to fill in you can start to see that hi-hat becomes this more erratic kind of improvised pattern. At least that's the effect it gives off, when actually that hi-hat is just fulfilling the role of filling in the gaps between the main rhythmic figures. Okay, you can start to see how that's built up. You're loving this lesson. Good. I'm glad. Thank you. I'm glad you are enjoying it, and I will address your question at the end, I promise. But can you start to see, can you start to hear how we can build up the phrasing, the voicing of this rhythmic figure one step at a time? Now, you imagine, and I've got to sort of condense this into a manageable 30-minute chunk. You imagine that you are very, very comfortable voicing that clave in lots of different ways. Yes, I was varying and syncopating the rhythm there, but it's still based on that clave figure with this hi-hat. Now, there's some more stuff going on there, but essentially a good first concept is for that hi-hat to be filling in the gaps of that rhythmic figure. You imagine you've got that. Start with another rhythmic figure, then another, and then break away from individual rhythmic figures and start combining rhythmic figures together so we can get to the point pretty difficult to kind of demonstrate, because we get to the next phase that I'm going to talk about, which is the use of vocabulary within that. Let me show you what I mean, right? Because I'm trying to sort of keep you on the straight and narrow with regards to the concept I'm talking about, which is the voicing of those rhythmic figures, while fighting off the other main element, which is the use of your own vocabulary, which is what I've been hinting at all along. But before I get onto that, the main conceptual element here is the voicing of rhythmic figures between the bass drum and the snare drum, with that hi-hat taking a supporting role, okay? Now, as you heard there with my kind of clumsy demonstration just then, that doesn't necessarily lend itself to the grooviest of grooves. It can give you a sort of skeleton figure, if you like. But because I'm not addressing this vocabulary thing that I'm going to come on to in a minute, it's a little bit fumbling around in the dark. At least that's what it feels like to play. I'm just kind of trying my best to cling on and keep an accent pattern going without any direction. So, where does that direction come from? I've mentioned vocabulary. And that vocabulary comes in the form of rhythmic motifs that we are familiar with. And this ties in directly to those of you who may have seen the Broken Time live stream I did yesterday, where we start to develop our own phrasing vocabulary based on rhythmic motifs. So we've just talked about the clave. Okay, that's a motif. It's a theme. It's a little rhythmic phrase, a figure. Call it what you will, but it's something that I'm familiar with, that I know how to voice in a number of different ways. Kind of like, as I've said, a word or a sentence that I know the meaning of, that I can use in conversation as I want to. If your practice becomes less about patterns and more about the incorporation of rhythmic motifs, you start to find you have some ammunition, some material available to you when you are improvising in this manner. So let's think of a shorter motif this time. Let's think of an odd-lengthed shorter motif. Okay, so at the moment the hi-hat... 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Okay, there we go. So my main rhythmic figure is here, which is essentially built off a dotted quarter note, I guess. Anyway, I'm not going to talk about how motivic figures can be developed at this stage, but we want to start working in terms of short, memorable rhythmic phrases. So I'm using this 3-beat one here. Let's add a hi-hat to that. Nice and simple. Now, yes, this is a pattern. And this completely seems to fly in the face of what I was talking about at the start of this video, that we don't want to rely on patterns, but bear with me. Acquisition of vocabulary is the goal here. So we've got this new rhythmic motif here. Relatively simple to play, and I'm feeling that as 16th notes. 1 E and a, 2 E and a, 3 E and a, 4 E and a, 1 E and a, etc. 3, 4. Okay. Let's see how we can work that in to the existing clave-based thing we've got on the go already. So I'm experimenting there with how those two phrases can start to combine together, all the while paying attention to the meter. 1, 2, 3, 4, because obviously a 3-beat motif is going to kind of mess you up in 4/4 if you're not careful with that. But can you start to hear there, even with a little bit of clumsy exploration like I was trying there, you can start to hear how this longer phrase starts to develop. Now, that's interesting. What I just did at the end there, it was that. That's an extension of that 3-beat motif, which is just that. But if I'm familiar with that motif, it becomes a diving board, right? A bouncing off point into a new phrase. Now, I would argue that all of that sort of stuff that I'm trying there is built off those two things we're talking about, the clave-based phrase and this 3-beat motif, and kind of jumping between those two to keep this time feel going. Now, I realize I'm kind of going off on a little bit of a tangent as I'm exploring these ideas, but what I want to get across to you is that the playing, especially the stuff I was doing at the beginning of this video, is not random. Right? I talked about this again in the Broken Time video yesterday. Improvisation is not random. This material has to come from somewhere. And in this instance, what we're talking about here conceptually, that material is coming from a rhythmic figure. And those rhythmic figures come from my own knowledge of rhythm. It's absolutely chucking it down. Sorry, where is that car? I've just looked out the window and it's the end of the world. We've got a monsoon outside. Great. Anyway. Those rhythmic figures are informing the phrasing that I'm playing, and my phrasing is informed by the rhythmic figures I'm familiar with. I can't play a rhythm that I'm not familiar with. So the broader my knowledge of rhythms, figures, time signatures, meters, polyrhythms, and all of that good stuff, the more I'm going to be able to apply these in my groove playing. Now, yes, I acknowledge that this is a kind of a higher level concept, that if you are more of a beginner drummer, and I don't mean this patronizing in any way, but if you are more of a beginner drummer, this might not necessarily be the most helpful to you, but as we start to become more and more confident on this instrument, we want to be exploring the rhythmic aspect more and more, and the patterns aspect less and less. Even though that is a pattern, it is the starting point for me becoming familiar with that rhythmic figure. All of those little figures there felt to me just like variations of that thing. As long as I'm hearing that rhythmic figure, that motif, how many times have I said rhythmic figure today? That motif is running through my mind, providing me the musical inspiration, and then my ability on the drums informs what I'm able to do with that and how I'm able to voice it. So when I'm improvising, like I was doing at the start of this video, all of that stuff, yes, okay, there's a lot of things going on there physically and conceptually. But they are all things that I've practiced, right? They are all motifs. There are little pieces of vocabulary in there, little phrases that I'm familiar with, rhythmic motifs that I'm familiar with. You'll notice if I were to carry on, it would start to sound similar to the stuff I was doing earlier because I'm producing my own vocabulary. I can't make this stuff up on the spot, right? I have to get that material from somewhere. My improvisational ammunition has to come from what I'm already familiar with. The best analogy I can give you here is if you're learning to speak in a foreign language and you are conversing somebody about politics and suddenly you run out of vocabulary, you don't know how to talk about politics in French, You can't make it up, right? You can't guess what the word for prime minister is, or politician, or left wing, or liberal, or whatever. You can't guess. You can only use the words and phrases in that language with which you are familiar. Likewise here. I'm not pulling that from nowhere. That's not spontaneous composition that you might think in the way you might think it is. This is all material I'm familiar with. This is all motifs, phrases, vocabulary segments that I'm comfortable enough with to string together. But this is the main point I'm trying to get across to you here. That is all informed by thinking in terms of the rhythmic figures. Da 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 ga ga da ga da ga da ga da dun dun bum ba ba da 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 dun da da dun da 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 dun dun da 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 da. That's really hard to do, but that's what I'm thinking. I'm hearing that rhythm, boom, ba, ba, da, 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 dun, da, 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 dun, da, dun, da, dun, dun, da, dun, da, 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 and then it just becomes a case of physically reproducing that thing that's going on. Now, I've rambled a little bit here. I'm going to address this question on the chat, and I'm going to address it in a manner that kind of ties this all together, because I appreciate I've kind of gone off on a little bit of a tangent here and not given you something that's necessarily the most pragmatic for those of you trying to study this. Because the question on the chat, how do I work on my coordination and articulation as a beginner? It's a very important question, and it ties into where does this material come from? I talked about using my own vocabulary, calling on my own knowledge of rhythmic figures, time signatures, polyrhythms, all of those things. What you are seeing there, when I'm kind of grooving in that manner, is the culmination of my entire life's study, right? That's not to say it's the only thing I'm capable of or the best thing I'm capable of, but what I'm doing there is pulling on all of my years of experience and drumming and study and practicing to produce something that is conceptually quite high level, okay? By voicing a constantly evolving rhythmic figure and keeping it groovy is pretty tough to do. It requires a lot of time and effort. So let's address how this all comes together then. How do you address your coordination and articulation as a beginner? Well, the simple answer is very, very slowly and with great care and attention. The more practical answer is it all comes down to what you study and the way you study it. There are lots of books out there. A great one is The New Breed, Gary Chester. The various interpretations of Ted Reed's syncopation. All of these books, especially those two, but the Gary Chester New Breed especially, it does two things for you. It addresses the coordination, because some of the way the book works, the patterns and the systems involved are really coordination heavy, but it does it with a way that gets you thinking about the rhythm. So to give you an example, one of the Gary Chester New Breed systems is something along the lines of this. Right? It's a pattern using 3 limbs. Very, very simple. I'm not sure if this is an exact pattern or not, but it does for now. But notice how this leaves 1 limb free. And what the New Breed gets you doing is improvising with this left hand by reading a rhythmic study. Etc. And you're getting those rhythms from the reading study. So I've spent a lot of time with that sort of thing, where I have a pattern going with most of my limbs, and then 1 limb is isolated to improvise the rhythmic figure. I've also spent a lot of time on the jazz-based motifs that I was talking about in the Broken Time study yesterday. I was distracted by the rain. But that's a motif-based approach to keeping time. So all of these elements are coming together to produce this ability to maintain a steady rhythmic figure in an improvisational manner. The improvisation does not mean I'm just making it up randomly. It means I'm voicing rhythmic figures that I am familiar with using the vocabulary that I have acquired throughout the course of my playing. And I talked more about the use of vocabulary in the previous two groove improvisation episodes. So, how do I address coordination and articulation as a beginner? Essentially, it just comes down to time. Okay, you need to find some kind of material. If you can, find a teacher, of course, right? Find a good teacher and work through coordination studies with them. But you need to address coordination specifically. It is a particular skill that is very, very unique to the drums because we have all four limbs going at the same time. I would recommend something like Gary Chester's New Breed, because that tackles the coordination, but it also gets you thinking in terms of rhythm. And that's really the point I was making at the start. When we are locked into patterns, even if it's a complicated pattern. Okay, it sounds good. It's a really cool groove and it sounds good and it's fun to play. It's still a pattern and I'm limited by that. Whereas if I apply that same sort of vocabulary that I acquired when I learnt that pattern, you can start to hear how that's informed by the same sort of playing, but I'm improvising the rhythmic figure rather than falling back on that individual pattern. Okay, I feel like I've repeated a lot of words there: pattern, rhythmic figure, motif, rhythmic figure. Anyway, I'll leave it there because I am repeating myself now, and we're at 33 minutes, which is a decent amount. I want to apologize for the beginners amongst you that may have felt that was a little bit useless. But I'm trying to give a good balance of levels here between addressing some more fundamental concepts and some slightly higher up concepts. But even for the beginners amongst you who thought it sounded very fancy but don't have much to take away, what I would encourage you to do is start thinking about the rhythms underneath the patterns you are playing. We all need patterns. Patterns are important. But even if you've got a groove like that you like, that you find you're playing time and time again, that you're a little bit restricted by, really listen to it and think, what's the rhythmic figure behind this? Okay, well, if I've got that rhythmic figure, I can vary it. All of those were just little variations of that original rhythmic figure. If you can hear that rhythm, you can then start voicing it within the patterns you were playing it earlier on. And then you're back into that sort of style of thing I was doing at the start. So thank you for bearing with me today. I hope this has been of some use to some of you. Again, thank you to my Patreon supporters. I really appreciate it. And if there are some of you who would like to support this channel and see more of this sort of thing, please consider Patreon. The links are in the description below, as is my website, which contains all of my music and my educational products and video lessons if you want to do that sort of thing. And I look forward to seeing you on the next one. As always, I value your feedback. So if you've enjoyed this, please let me know. And let me know if there's anything in particular you would want to see covered, especially if you are a Patreon supporter, right? Thank you very much. Have a good weekend. I hope it's not raining where you are as much as it is here. Stay safe, and I'll see you on the next one. Thanks, guys. Work hard.